The studio lights were hotter than anyone had warned her. They pressed down like a silent spotlight from heaven itself, magnifying every shimmer of fabric, every bead of perspiration, every tremor in a performer's breath. Ann-Margret stood center stage in a dress that had been tailored to capture the glow of the camera, stitched with care, cinched with elegance, and meant to move with rhythm and confidence. She had worn many costumes before, had stepped onto countless sets with poise and charisma, but that morning felt different in a way she could not yet name. There was anticipation in the air, not the nervous kind that weakens resolve, but the electric kind that makes artists sharper, brighter, more alive. Across the room, Elvis leaned casually against a wooden prop piano, his posture relaxed yet observant. He had already filmed 2 takes that morning, his presence filling the soundstage in that quiet way only certain people can command without trying. Fame had wrapped itself around him long ago, but those who worked closely with him knew that beneath the iconic silhouette was a man who paid attention. He noticed details, he noticed people, and he noticed when someone's smile didn't quite reach their eyes. Ann-Margret adjusted the hem of her dress while a costume assistant hurried past with a clipboard. The director called for a rehearsal run. Music crackled softly through the speakers, then grew stronger as the band behind the camera warmed into the melody. It was a scene designed to sparkle, flirtatious choreography, quick footwork, playful exchange. The rhythm required energy and closeness. It required trust. She took her mark. The music began. The first few steps flowed effortlessly. Ann-Margret moved with confidence, the dress catching the light as she turned. Elvis stepped in perfectly on cue, their timing instinctive, their chemistry undeniable but respectful, 2 professionals sharing space within the rhythm of a story. The crew watched through camera monitors, pleased. It was working. It was alive. Then it happened. It was subtle at first, a faint sound lost beneath the music, a seam strained where fabric met movement. Ann-Margret felt it before she heard it, a shift in tension, a loosening. Then the unmistakable sensation of cloth giving way under pressure. The back seam of her dress had split. For a fraction of a second, her body froze, though her face remained trained in performance. Years of discipline kept her expression steady, but her mind raced. She could feel the air where fabric should have been. She could imagine the camera angle. She could imagine headlines that would not speak of her talent, but only of an embarrassing moment replayed in whispers. The music continued. The crew hadn't yet realized. But Elvis had. He saw it instantly, not because he was looking for it, but because he was watching her, truly watching her, the way an attentive partner does. In that brief second of understanding, he made a choice that would not appear in scripts, would not be highlighted in promotional materials, but would remain etched into memory. Without breaking rhythm, he shifted the choreography. Instead of the planned turn that would have exposed her back to the camera, he stepped closer, altering the angle of his body. His arm moved naturally around her shoulders as though it were part of the dance, shielding her from view. He rotated them both, guiding her toward a position where the camera captured only the front of her dress and his steady silhouette behind her. The director assumed it was improvisation. The crew assumed it was flair. Ann-Margret realized it was protection. He leaned slightly, voice low enough that only she could hear over the music. "Keep smiling," he murmured gently. "I've got you." The reassurance steadied her heartbeat. She continued the choreography, adjusting subtly to his lead. Each movement he chose served a purpose, covering, shielding, redirecting. When the sequence required a spin, he transformed it into a dip. When the script called for separation, he bridged the distance with a playful step that felt intentional and artistic. The moment that could have unraveled into humiliation instead became seamless. The director finally called, "Cut." Applause echoed lightly from a few crew members who thought they had just witnessed a brilliant, spontaneous adjustment. Ann-Margret exhaled carefully. Elvis kept his arm around her just long enough for the wardrobe assistant to rush in with a garment bag. Only then did the crew understand. There were murmurs, a few embarrassed apologies from costume staff, but there was no laughter, no pointing, no spectacle. Elvis's calm handling of the moment had set the tone. What could have become gossip dissolved into professionalism. Ann-Margret slipped behind a screen to change. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the torn seam. It wasn't the fabric that had shaken her, it was the vulnerability. Performers live in front of lenses, but they still carry private fears. The world can be unkind to women in the spotlight, quick to reduce them to moments instead of honoring their artistry. When she stepped back onto the set in a new dress, Elvis was waiting near the piano again. Not hovering, not dramatizing, just present. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She met his eyes and nodded. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than the situation itself. It wasn't just about a dress. It was about dignity. It was about someone choosing kindness when it would have been easier to laugh or look away. He shrugged gently, almost embarrassed by gratitude. "We're a team out here," he replied. "Nobody falls alone." Those who witnessed the moment would later recall not the tear in the fabric, but the way he handled it, without spectacle, without ego, without drawing attention to himself. Fame often magnifies personalities into caricatures, but in that quiet decision under bright lights, something truer revealed itself. The rest of the day moved smoothly. The repaired costume held firm. The scene was completed in 2 more takes, radiant and confident. But something had shifted between them, not romance as tabloids might frame it, but trust. A shared understanding that behind the glamour were 2 human beings navigating pressures few could comprehend. That evening, as the set emptied and technicians dismantled lights, Ann-Margret lingered near the soundstage doors. She watched Elvis laugh with a crew member, saw the ease in his manner, the unforced humility that rarely made headlines. She realized that real character is not displayed in grand gestures, but in split-second decisions when no applause is guaranteed. A torn seam could have been a humiliating story. Instead, it became a quiet testament. And neither of them yet knew that this small act of kindness would ripple far beyond that day, shaping conversations, memories, and an unspoken respect that would endure long after the cameras stopped rolling. The next morning, the studio felt different to Ann-Margret, though nothing in its physical structure had changed. The same towering lights hung overhead. The same cables stretched across the polished floor. The same camera operators adjusted their lenses with professional calm. Yet there was a quiet awareness in her chest, an echo of the previous day's vulnerability that had settled deeper than she expected. Performers learn early how to recover from mistakes, how to laugh off missteps, how to continue under pressure, but what lingers is not always the embarrassment itself. Sometimes it is the reminder of how fragile dignity can feel under the glare of public scrutiny. She arrived earlier than usual, script in hand, reviewing her lines with focused intensity. Her discipline was never in question. She had built her career on precision and preparation. But what few understood was the unspoken burden that accompanied her rising fame. As a young woman in an industry that celebrated charm and beauty as much as talent, she carried constant awareness of how easily public perception could tilt. A torn seam was not merely fabric undone. It symbolized how quickly control could slip away in an environment where narratives were often shaped by others. Elvis arrived moments later, guitar case resting against his leg, as he greeted crew members with an easy nod. His presence on set had always been magnetic, but it was not the stardom that defined him in private moments. It was attentiveness. He noticed when the lighting crew seemed fatigued. He noticed when a background dancer struggled with choreography. And that morning, he noticed the subtle tightness in Ann-Margret's posture even as she smiled through rehearsals. The director called for blocking adjustments to refine the next sequence. It was a lively scene, full of movement and playful banter that required confidence and spontaneity. Ann-Margret performed flawlessly, yet Elvis sensed something restrained in her movements, a slight hesitation during turns that would normally be effortless. During a short break, he approached her quietly, careful not to draw attention. "You're thinking about yesterday," he said gently, not as an accusation but as understanding. She inhaled slowly, choosing honesty over deflection. "It's silly, I know," she replied, her voice steady yet reflective. "But in this business, one small moment can overshadow years of work." He leaned against a nearby prop table, thoughtful. "It shouldn't," he answered. "What people remember most is how someone carries themselves. You didn't miss a beat. That's what matters." His words were simple, but their sincerity carried weight. Fame had taught him harsh lessons about public perception. He knew how easily stories could twist, how narratives could drift from truth. Yet he also understood that control does not come from silence alone. It comes from integrity displayed consistently, especially in moments that test composure. The filming resumed and the choreography grew more demanding. This time, when a spin approached, Elvis subtly reinforced his stance, offering stability without making it obvious. Their movements regained fluidity, trust rebuilding with each synchronized step. The crew sensed the chemistry returning, not merely as performance but as partnership. It was not dramatic or theatrical, it was grounded and professional, two artists navigating an unpredictable environment with mutual respect. Behind the scenes, whispers occasionally traveled through the corridors of Hollywood, stories inflated by curiosity and speculation. But on that set, there was a protective boundary built not from secrecy but from professionalism. Elvis never mentioned the incident publicly. He did not recount it for amusement or anecdote. In an industry where gossip often served as currency, his silence became its own statement. As the days progressed, Ann-Margret felt a shift within herself. The fear that had momentarily tightened her chest gave way to something steadier. She began to see that the real measure of a performer was not immunity to mishap, but resilience in its aftermath. She stood taller in rehearsals, not because perfection was guaranteed, but because she had experienced firsthand that someone beside her valued dignity over spectacle. One afternoon, while reviewing a particularly intricate musical number, the costume designer approached her with renewed caution, double-checking every seam and fastening. Ann-Margret offered a reassuring smile. "It's all right," she said kindly. "Mistakes happen. We just learn and move forward." The designer exhaled with gratitude, clearly relieved by her grace. That quiet moment echoed the kindness she herself had received, demonstrating how compassion can ripple outward in subtle yet powerful ways. Elvis, observing from across the room, understood something profound about human nature. In a world fixated on image, character reveals itself not when everything runs smoothly, but when something falters. He had grown accustomed to cameras capturing his performances, but what mattered most were the unseen decisions, the instinct to shield, to protect, to uplift without claiming credit. Those were not scripted gestures. They were reflections of upbringing, of values instilled long before fame reshaped his world. During a late evening rehearsal, as shadows stretched long across the set, Ann-Margret paused beside him while technicians adjusted lighting angles. "You didn't have to do that yesterday," she said softly, referring to the moment that still lingered in her thoughts. "You could have just kept dancing." He looked at her thoughtfully, then gave a modest shrug. "My mama always said you look out for people," he replied. "Doesn't matter who's watching." The simplicity of that answer struck her more deeply than any grand declaration could have. In an industry often defined by competition, ego, and relentless ambition, such grounded wisdom felt rare. It reminded her that behind stage names and marquee lights were individuals shaped by family, by faith, by quiet lessons learned far from Hollywood's glamour. As filming continued over the following weeks, their camaraderie strengthened. They shared stories between takes, spoke of the pressures that accompanied rising fame, and laughed about the absurdities that occasionally unfolded on set. Yet beneath the laughter was mutual respect. They recognized in each other a shared vulnerability, the understanding that success does not eliminate uncertainty, it often magnifies it. The crew began to notice a subtle shift in energy whenever they worked together. There was ease in their interactions, a confidence born not of perfection, but of trust. The director appreciated the authenticity that emerged in scenes, unaware that its roots traced back to a moment of unexpected vulnerability and quiet protection. Ann-Margret, reflecting one evening in her dressing room, realized that what had initially felt like a potential humiliation had instead revealed something deeper about resilience. She understood that her worth as an artist was not tethered to flawless presentation, but to the strength with which she navigated imperfection. And she understood that true partnership, whether in art or life, is measured by how individuals respond when circumstances falter. The torn dress was repaired and stored away, likely forgotten by many who moved on to new productions. But for her, it became symbolic of something enduring, the knowledge that even in the brightest spotlight, humanity matters more than spectacle. And for Elvis, it was another quiet chapter in a life often examined through grand narratives, yet shaped most profoundly by small, unheralded choices. Neither of them sought applause for that moment. There were no interviews recounting it, no headlines celebrating restraint. But within the rhythm of their shared experience, a deeper harmony formed, one rooted not in glamour, but in character. Long after the applause faded, and the last light on the soundstage dimmed to a faint amber glow, the true weight of a moment often begins to settle. Film sets are built for spectacle, for capturing emotion within the boundaries of scripted timing, but life rarely confines itself so neatly. For Ann-Margret, The days following the incident unfolded with professional precision on the surface, yet beneath that composure lay a deeper transformation. It was not the tear in the fabric that lingered in her memory, but the quiet steadiness of someone choosing to protect rather than exploit vulnerability. Hollywood had a rhythm of its own. It thrived on momentum, on constant motion, on new stories eclipsing old ones before they had fully cooled. Yet for performers, moments on set do not disappear simply because the cameras stop. They imprint themselves in ways that shape posture, perspective, and trust. Ann-Margret had long understood the demands of being watched, but that single second when the seam of her dress gave way reminded her how exposed the spotlight can make a person feel. What surprised her most was not the vulnerability itself, but the realization that dignity can be preserved when someone else decides it matters. Elvis, for his part, carried on as he always did, unassuming and focused on the work. He never referenced the moment again in front of the crew, never hinted at it in casual conversation. In an industry where anecdotes often became currency for storytelling, his silence was deliberate. It was not secrecy born of fear, but discretion rooted in respect. He understood instinctively that not every event deserves retelling, especially when retelling might shift the focus from artistry to embarrassment. As filming progressed into longer days and more demanding sequences, the bond between them deepened in subtle ways. Their rehearsals felt less cautious and more fluid. Ann-Margret no longer held back during spins or intricate movements. Instead, she allowed herself to perform with full confidence, trusting the environment around her. Trust, she realized, is not built through grand declarations but through consistent action. The memory of that protected moment lingered like a quiet assurance beneath every step. One afternoon, after an especially complex dance number, the cast gathered in a quieter corner of the studio while technicians reset equipment. The conversation drifted from choreography to the pressures of public life. Fame, they agreed, has a way of magnifying both triumphs and missteps. Elvis listened more than he spoke, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed the reflections of those around him. When he finally added his voice, it was measured and calm. He spoke about remembering who you are when the world insists on defining you by headlines. He spoke about keeping a circle of people who remind you of your values. And he spoke about kindness as something that costs nothing but means everything. Ann-Margret watched him as he spoke, struck by the consistency between his words and his actions. The industry often blurred the lines between persona and person, but what she had witnessed was not performance. It was instinct. She understood then that character reveals itself most clearly in unscripted seconds when no one has time to strategize or posture. Their conversations during breaks grew more reflective. They spoke of their families, of childhood influences, of the unexpected paths that led them to center stage. They shared stories not meant for tabloids but for understanding. In those exchanges, Ann-Margret began to see fame less as a pedestal and more as a responsibility. Every action under the spotlight, no matter how small, had the power to shape the tone of an entire set. Leadership, she realized, did not require titles. It required intention. The crew sensed the atmosphere shift over time. There was less tension during demanding scenes, fewer whispered anxieties about wardrobe mishaps or staging errors. Mistakes, when they occurred, were handled with calm correction rather than sharp criticism. A single act of consideration had rippled outward, influencing how others responded to vulnerability. It created a standard without anyone announcing it. One evening, after filming wrapped earlier than expected, Ann-Margret lingered on the empty stage, gazing at the now quiet cameras. The vastness of the set felt different without its usual hum of activity. Elvis joined her, guitar slung casually over his shoulder, having stayed behind to practice a melody for an upcoming number. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, absorbing the stillness. "It's strange," she said softly, her voice echoing faintly in the empty space. "How one small thing can change how you see everything." He nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes it's the small things that show you what really matters. She reflected on the pressures that had once seemed overwhelming, the constant scrutiny, the fear of public misinterpretation, the relentless need to appear flawless. That torn seam had felt catastrophic for a fleeting second, but what endured was the realization that integrity shields more effectively than perfection ever could. Elvis strummed a few quiet chords, the sound warm and steady. "You know," he added after a pause, "people remember how you make them feel, not just what they see on screen." Those words lingered in the air between them. Ann-Margret understood then that legacy is not solely defined by awards or box office numbers. It is built from countless interactions, from the tone one sets in challenging moments, from the decision to elevate rather than diminish. In the weeks that followed, the production wrapped successfully, and the cast prepared to move on to new projects. Farewells were exchanged, promises to stay in touch offered with genuine warmth. Yet beneath the routine closure of a finished film was a shared recognition that something meaningful had occurred beyond the script. For Ann-Margret, the experience became a quiet benchmark in her career. Whenever new sets brought fresh uncertainties, she carried with her the memory of that moment, not as a source of fear, but as proof that grace under pressure invites respect. She resolved to extend that same protective awareness to others, especially younger performers navigating their first encounters with vulnerability. For Elvis, the moment blended seamlessly into a life composed of many unseen acts of consideration. He did not catalog his kindness, nor did he seek acknowledgement. But those who worked closely with him remembered. They remembered the steadiness in his movements, the absence of mockery, the quiet leadership that emerged without spectacle. Years later, when both had long moved beyond that particular production, the story would surface occasionally in private recollections, not as gossip, but as testament. It became an example shared quietly among those who valued professionalism and humanity over drama. It served as a reminder that true character does not require announcement. It reveals itself naturally when tested. The cameras may have stopped rolling that day, but the impression left behind continued to shape perspective long after the lights dimmed. In a world often captivated by scandal and sensationalism, the quieter stories of dignity and respect endure with greater strength. And so, what could have been a fleeting embarrassment transformed into something enduring? A shared understanding that behind the glamour of Hollywood, the most powerful moments are those where compassion prevails. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of memory while preserving its meaning. Years passed, projects came and went, accolades accumulated, and both Ann-Margret and Elvis continued to navigate careers that would etch their names into cultural history. Audiences remembered the music, the charisma, the performances that lit up screens and stages across the world. Yet behind those celebrated images were quieter stories that never reached headlines, but shaped the foundation of how they were remembered by those who stood beside them. For Ann-Margret, the incident on that soundstage gradually transformed into something more symbolic than literal. It was no longer about a torn seam or a moment of near embarrassment. Instead, it became a reminder that even under relentless scrutiny, dignity can be preserved when someone chooses compassion over indifference. The experience altered the way she approached her own presence on set. As her career advanced, she became more attentive to younger performers, more protective of those stepping into the spotlight for the first time. She understood the silent anxieties that accompany bright lights and unblinking cameras. She knew how exposed one can feel when expectations hover heavily in the air. And because she had once been shielded in a moment of vulnerability, she instinctively sought to extend that same grace to others. Her colleagues often described her as steady and generous, qualities that are rarely cultivated without experience. In interviews years later, she would speak about professionalism and kindness as inseparable elements of artistry. Though she never dramatized past events, those who listened carefully sensed that her conviction was rooted in lived understanding. She had witnessed firsthand how quickly circumstances can shift and how deeply a single act of discretion can restore confidence. It was not a lesson taught in acting classes or rehearsed in front of mirrors. It was learned in a split second when someone decided her dignity mattered more than applause. Elvis, too, carried forward the quiet philosophy that had guided him that day. His life, often magnified through the lens of fame, was full of public triumphs and private complexities. Yet those who worked closely with him frequently spoke of his instinct to look out for people. It was not a trait performed for image. It was woven into his upbringing and reinforced through experience. He understood what it felt like to be scrutinized, to have every gesture interpreted, to have narratives shaped without full context. That understanding fueled a deep sense of empathy. When faced with a moment where another person's vulnerability was exposed, his reaction was not calculated. It was immediate, protective, human. Over time, the story of that day would resurface occasionally among crew members who remembered it vividly. It was never recounted as scandal or spectacle. Instead, it was shared as an example of leadership without ego. In an industry that sometimes thrives on competition and comparison, the memory of someone choosing discretion over drama felt refreshing. It reminded those who heard it that character is not measured by how brightly one shines alone, but by how thoughtfully one ensures others are not diminished in the process. The passage of years often reveals the true weight of seemingly small decisions. What felt like an instinctive adjustment in choreography became part of a broader narrative about integrity. Ann-Margret would later reflect privately on how that moment strengthened her resilience. She recognized that vulnerability, when met with compassion rather than ridicule, does not weaken a person. It fortifies them. It transforms fear into confidence, caution into courage. The experience taught her that setbacks need not define identity when they are handled with grace. As both artists matured, their reputations expanded beyond performance alone. They were remembered not only for talent but for presence, for how they treated colleagues, how they carried themselves during difficult moments, how they navigated the intersection of art and humanity. In retrospectives and conversations about their legacies, fans often focused on iconic scenes and unforgettable songs. Yet behind those celebrated highlights were countless quiet choices that shaped the environments in which they worked. Ann-Margret's later years in the industry were marked by a calm assurance that younger performers found reassuring. She had endured the intensity of public attention and emerged with a deeper understanding of what truly sustains a career: resilience, professionalism, and empathy. The memory of standing on that stage, momentarily uncertain, and then realizing she was not alone in that uncertainty, became a quiet cornerstone of her confidence. It reinforced her belief that collaboration, not competition, forms the heart of meaningful artistry. Elvis's legacy, too, became layered with stories that spoke to his humanity as much as his musical brilliance. Those who looked beyond headlines discovered anecdotes of generosity, of support offered without expectation of recognition. The incident with Ann-Margret was simply one thread in a larger tapestry of behavior that reflected his core values. It illustrated how instinctive kindness can ripple outward in ways that endure long after applause fades. What stands out most about that day is not the potential embarrassment but the transformation of it. A moment that could have spiraled into discomfort instead became a testament to partnership. It showed that strength is not loud, that protection need not be theatrical, and that dignity thrives when guarded with care. The spotlight, often relentless and unforgiving, briefly revealed something gentler: the power of a steady presence beside someone who needs it. Years later, when audiences revisit their performances together, they see chemistry, charisma, and artistry. They see two stars shining brightly. What they may not see is the foundation beneath that shine, a shared understanding built from trust. That trust did not come from scripted lines or rehearsed exchanges. It grew from an unscripted moment where one chose to shield and the other chose to continue with grace. In the broader arc of their lives, countless events would shape their journeys. Successes would soar, challenges would test endurance. Yet woven among those grand chapters were small, defining instants that revealed who they truly were. The torn dress on a soundstage became one such instant, not because of its visibility, but because of how it was handled. Ultimately, legacy is not forged solely in moments of triumph. It is shaped in moments of choice. When faced with the unexpected, when vulnerability appears without warning, the decision to act with compassion can echo far beyond the immediate circumstance. Ann-Margret carried forward renewed confidence. Elvis carried forward the quiet consistency of his values. And those who witnessed the moment carried forward a story about character, one that needed no embellishment to endure. In a world often captivated by drama, the enduring power of that story lies in its simplicity. A seam tore, a partner adjusted, a smile remained, and dignity prevailed.